Hey guys, tonight, we're not heading to the grand halls, or the glittering banquet tables, or those overly dramatic throne rooms where everyone pretends to be important. No, tonight we're going somewhere quieter, colder, slightly damp. The kind of place where footsteps echo a little too much, and nobody really wants to stay longer than necessary. So, dim the lights a bit. Get comfortable. Maybe pull a blanket over yourself. Because we're going down, slowly, gently, into the underground world of castle dungeons and forgotten cells, where history didn't shout, it just kind of sat there, quietly suffering. Now, when people think of castles, they usually imagine tall towers, royal drama, maybe a king dramatically staring out a window like he's in a low-budget movie. But beneath all that, there was another world. A hidden one. Built not for glory, but for control. For punishment. And sometimes, just for convenience. Because, of course, if you're a medieval ruler, and someone annoys you, what's easier than just putting them somewhere underground and forgetting about them? Let's start gently. Imagine a stone staircase. Narrow, uneven, worn down by years of footsteps. You're walking down it slowly, maybe holding a torch, because electricity is still a few centuries away, unfortunately. The air gets cooler with every step. A little heavier. A little quieter. And then, you reach the bottom. This is where the castle stops pretending to be elegant. The walls here are thick. Rough stone. No decoration. No tapestries. No attempt to impress anyone. Just cold, practical design. Because this space wasn't meant to be admired, it was meant to hold people. Quietly. Firmly. And often, indefinitely. Now, here's the interesting part. Dungeons weren't always these dramatic torture chambers you see in movies. In fact, a lot of them were surprisingly boring. Small rooms. Low ceilings. Maybe a wooden door reinforced with iron. Or sometimes, just iron bars. And inside, a person. Or a few people. Sitting. Waiting. Thinking about their life choices, which had clearly not gone well. Because getting thrown into a dungeon usually meant one thing: you had either annoyed someone powerful, or you had simply been inconvenient. And in medieval times, inconvenience was a serious crime. Take, for example, the unfortunate case of minor nobles who found themselves on the wrong side of family politics. Royal families were complicated. Not in a fun, slightly awkward holiday dinner kind of way, but in a deeply unsettling, someone might disappear tonight kind of way. If a prince had too many brothers, well, some of those brothers might quietly relocate to a nice underground room. No windows. No visitors. Just time. Lots and lots of time. And the thing is, it wasn't always dramatic. There wasn't always a big arrest or a public accusation. Sometimes, it was just a quiet decision. He could be a problem later. And just like that, dungeon. Now, let's pause for a moment and imagine the daily routine down there. Because, oddly enough, there was one. Morning, if you could call it that, arrived without sunlight. Just the faint sound of movement above. Maybe footsteps. Maybe distant voices. The world continuing, without you. Food would arrive, eventually. Usually simple. Bread. Water. Occasionally something slightly better, if the person in charge was feeling generous, or forgetful in a good way. And then, the rest of the day. Sitting. Thinking. Listening. Because when you're in a dungeon, sound becomes everything. The drip of water. The shuffle of guards. The occasional distant clang of metal. It all starts to feel important. Like your brain is trying to hold on to anything, just to pass the time. Now, here's where things get a bit, quietly strange. Some prisoners weren't criminals at all. Not really. Some were scholars. Advisors. Even former friends of the king. People who had simply said the wrong thing, at the wrong time. Which, to be fair, is still a risky strategy today. But back then, the consequences were a bit more permanent. Let's float over to another kind of dungeon, the deeper kind. The ones that weren't just rooms, but actual pits. Yes, pits. Because apparently, someone at some point thought, you know what would make this more efficient? A hole. And so, they built vertical cells. Sometimes called oubliettes, which is a very fancy word that basically means a place to be forgotten. Which is not exactly comforting. These were often small, circular chambers, accessed from above. Prisoners would be lowered down, or sometimes, just dropped in, depending on how much effort people felt like putting in that day. And once you were in, that was it. No doors. No easy way out. Just stone walls rising above you, and a small opening far overhead, letting in a thin slice of light, during the day. At night, just darkness. Now, again, not always dramatic. No constant screaming. No theatrical suffering. Just quiet. Long uneventful quiet. Which, in a way, might have been the most unsettling part. Because humans are not particularly good at doing nothing for very long. And yet, that's exactly what many of these prisoners had to do. Now, of course, not all dungeons were equal. Some castles had relatively comfortable cells, if you can even use that word here. A bit more space. Maybe a bench. Sometimes even a small window, if the castle designers were feeling unusually kind. Others were less generous. Damp floors. Low air circulation. And that persistent feeling that the walls themselves were slowly closing in, even if they weren't. And then, there were the guards. Now, guards are interesting. Because they were often the only connection between the prisoner and the outside world. And their behavior could vary, wildly. Some were indifferent. Just doing their job. Delivering food. Checking locks. Not particularly interested in conversation. Others were a bit more talkative. Occasionally sharing news. Gossip from above. Small details about the world that the prisoner could no longer see. And those small details became incredibly valuable. Because when you're cut off from everything, even the tiniest piece of information feels important. Now, let's gently shift our attention to another aspect of dungeon life, time. Time in a dungeon is strange. Without sunlight, without regular activity, it becomes difficult to measure. Days blend together. Weeks feel like days. Or maybe the other way around. It's hard to tell. Some prisoners tried to keep track, scratching marks into the walls. Small lines. One for each day, or what they believed was a day. Others eventually stopped trying. Because when there's no clear end, counting can feel a bit pointless. And yet, life continued. Slowly. Quietly. Now, here's something slightly ironic. Castles were symbols of power. Strength. Stability. But the dungeons beneath them often revealed the opposite. Fear. Because many of the people locked away weren't enemies in a traditional sense. They weren't invading armies or dangerous criminals. They were relatives, advisors, rivals, people who simply existed, a little too close to power. And instead of dealing with them openly, rulers often chose the quieter option. Out of sight, out of mind. Which, as it turns out, was a very popular strategy. Let's drift for a moment to a cold evening somewhere in medieval Europe. The castle above is alive with activity. A feast, perhaps. Laughter. Music. Flickering candlelight. And below, in the dungeon, none of that exists. Just stillness. Maybe a prisoner sits against the wall, listening faintly to the distant sounds above. A reminder that life is continuing, just not for them. And that contrast is what makes these places so quietly fascinating. Not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they weren't. They were still. And in that stillness, history unfolded in its own slow, almost sleepy way. And as we continue tonight, we'll gently wander through more of these spaces, meeting the kinds of people who ended up here, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design, and sometimes, simply because they were born into the wrong family, at the wrong time. So don't worry, nothing too intense. Nothing too dramatic. Just a slow, quiet journey, through the places history tried its best to forget. Hey guys, tonight, we're going somewhere a little quieter than usual. Not the loud battlefields. Not the dramatic coronations. No, tonight we're slipping gently into the background of history, into a place where things moved slowly, where time stretched out, and where life became very, very simple. So go ahead, dim the lights. Put your phone on silent. Get comfortable, because we're heading into a world of chains, darkness, and the surprisingly routine nature of daily survival. Now, when we hear the word chains, it sounds dramatic. Heavy. Almost cinematic. But in reality, it was often much less exciting, and far more uncomfortable. Chains weren't about spectacle. They were about practicality. A way to keep someone exactly where they were, without needing constant supervision. Which, if you're a busy medieval guard, is quite convenient. And so, let's imagine one of these prisoners. Not a villain. Not necessarily dangerous. Just, someone who ended up in the wrong situation. Maybe they upset a noble. Maybe they were born into the wrong branch of a royal family, which, as we'll see, was a surprisingly common problem. They sit against a cold stone wall. The chain is attached to an iron ring, fixed into the masonry. It's not moving anywhere. And neither are they. The chain itself isn't always tight. Sometimes there's just enough length to stand, maybe take a few steps, sit back down again. A very small range of motion. Almost like pacing, but without the freedom. And that becomes the rhythm of the day. Stand. Sit. Shift position. Repeat. Now, here's the interesting part. Humans are incredibly adaptable. Even in situations like this, people found ways to create a kind of routine. Morning, again, if we can call it that, arrives without sunlight. There's no alarm clock, of course. Just a vague sense that time has passed. Maybe the guard's footsteps echo down the corridor. Maybe there's a faint change in the air. And then, food. Usually simple. Bread, if you're lucky. Water, definitely. Occasionally something slightly more substantial, though it's best not to think too hard about what it might be. And the way food is delivered is almost comically casual. A door opens. A bowl is placed down. No conversation. No ceremony. Just a quiet acknowledgement that, yes, you are still here. Which, in itself, becomes a kind of reassurance. Because in these places, being remembered, even briefly, matters. Now, let's talk about the darkness. It's not always complete. That's a common misconception. Some dungeon spaces had small openings, narrow slits in the stone, letting in just enough light to create a faint outline of the room. But it's never bright. Never comfortable. More like a permanent twilight. A soft, gray dimness that makes everything feel slower. And over time, your eyes adjust. You start noticing small details. The texture of the walls. The pattern of moisture on the floor. Tiny changes that would seem completely unimportant anywhere else. But here, they become something to focus on. Because focus is how you pass the time. Now, of course, not everyone handled this equally well. Some prisoners became quiet. Reflective. Spending hours, thinking about their past. Replaying conversations. Imagining different outcomes. That one decision they made, which, in hindsight, probably wasn't their best. Others talked. To themselves. To the walls. To anyone who might be listening, which, most of the time, was no one. And it wasn't necessarily madness. It was just a way to keep the mind active. Because silence, over long periods, can feel heavier than any chain. Let's gently move to another detail, the physical environment. Dungeons weren't designed for comfort. That's obvious. But they also weren't always deliberately cruel. Most of the time, they were just neglected. The floor might be uneven. Slightly damp. Not soaking wet, just enough to be mildly uncomfortable at all times. A constant reminder that this is not a place meant for living. Even though people did, for months, or years. The air can be stale. Not unbreathable, just lacking freshness. Like a room that hasn't been opened in a very long time. And then, there's the temperature. Cool. Consistently cool. Which, depending on the season, might actually be preferable to the heat above. A small, Unintended luxury, if you're feeling optimistic. Now, here's where things get a bit, quietly ironic. Some of the people living like this, were once surrounded by extreme comfort. Nobles. Royals. Individuals who had grown up with servants, fine clothes, elaborate meals. And suddenly, this. A stone wall. A chain. A piece of bread. It's quite a dramatic lifestyle change, though, again, not in a loud way. More like a slow realization, settling in over time. Oh, this is my life now. Let's float over to another kind of daily experience, interaction. Or rather, the lack of it. Because most prisoners didn't have regular conversations. Guards weren't there to chat. They had duties. Locks to check. Routines to follow. But occasionally, there would be moments. A guard lingering for a second longer than usual. A brief exchange of words. Maybe even a small piece of news from outside. And those moments became incredibly valuable. Imagine hearing about a festival happening above. Music. Dancing. Light. All the things that feel very distant now. It's not necessarily upsetting. Not dramatically so. Just a gentle reminder of a different world. A world that continues, with or without you. Now, let's talk about chains again, because they weren't always used the same way. Sometimes, they were more symbolic than restrictive. A light restraint. Enough to indicate that you're not free, but not so heavy that movement is impossible. Other times, they were more substantial. Heavier iron. Less mobility. Especially for prisoners considered important. Because, of course, the more valuable or potentially troublesome you were, the more effort went into keeping you exactly where you belonged. Which, in a strange way, meant that high status could make your situation slightly worse. A small perk of being unimportant, perhaps. Now, as time passes, something interesting happens. The environment stops feeling new. The discomfort becomes familiar. The routine settles in. And life continues. Not in a grand, exciting way. But in small, quiet increments. A day passes. Then another. Then another. No big events. No dramatic changes. Just existence. And for many prisoners, that was the reality. Not a short, intense experience, but a long, drawn-out period of waiting. Waiting for release. Waiting for a decision. Waiting for something to change. And sometimes, nothing did. Now, let's gently shift to a slightly different perspective. Imagine you're a guard. You walk these corridors every day. The same paths. The same doors. The same quiet presence of people behind them. At first, it might feel strange. Unsettling, even. But over time, it becomes routine. You deliver food. You check locks. You move on. The prisoners become part of the environment. Not necessarily people you interact with, just there. And that's another layer of this world. Not just the experience of being inside, but the experience of maintaining it. A system, quietly functioning, beneath the surface of castle life. Now, let's drift back to our prisoner, sitting against the wall, the chain resting lightly beside them. They've adjusted. Not completely, but enough. They've found ways to pass the time. To think. To exist within the limits of their situation. And while it's not a life anyone would choose, it is a life. Slow. Quiet. Predictable. And as we continue tonight, we'll meet more of these individuals. Some born into privilege, who somehow ended up here. Others, caught in the complex web of royal politics, where being related to the wrong person could lead to a very long stay underground. So just relax, let the story drift along, and we'll keep moving, slowly, through the quiet, dimly lit world, where history didn't shout, it simply endured. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little quieter than kings shouting orders or armies marching dramatically across muddy fields. No, tonight we're stepping into a slower space. A place where history didn't really bother to remember names, where stories faded before they were even fully told. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle into your pillow, maybe close your eyes for a moment. Because we're about to drift into the soft, gray world of crimes, justice, and the many, many people who simply disappeared from the record. Now, when we think about justice in the medieval world, we tend to imagine something very dramatic. Loud accusations. Pointing fingers. Big speeches. Maybe someone dramatically declaring innocence while everyone gasps. But in reality, it was often much less theatrical. Sometimes justice was just a decision. Quick. Quiet. And not always particularly fair. Because the truth is, most people who got caught up in the system weren't powerful enough to make a scene. They didn't have a voice that carried very far. And so their stories became small. Almost invisible. Let's imagine one of them. Not a famous figure. Not a noble. Just an ordinary person. Maybe a merchant. Maybe a servant. Maybe someone who said the wrong thing to the wrong person, which, as it turns out, was a surprisingly easy mistake to make. They stand in a small courtyard. Nothing grand. Just a few officials. A guard or two. Maybe a local authority figure who looks mildly bored, because this is probably the third case today. There's no long trial. No careful examination of evidence. Just a few questions. A few answers. And then, a conclusion. Because, of course, why spend hours investigating, when you can simply decide? And just like that, a judgment is made. Now, here's where things get a bit quietly unsettling, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a slow, creeping realization kind of way. Many of these people didn't fully understand what was happening to them. Legal systems were complicated. Not in the structured, well-documented way we might think of today, but in a very inconsistent, depends on who you are and who you know, kind of way. Which meant that two people could commit the same act, and receive completely different outcomes. One might walk away with a warning. The other might not walk away at all. And often, the difference wasn't the crime. It was the person. Let's float over to another case, a slightly more familiar type. A minor noble, caught in a political disagreement. Now, this is where things become quietly ironic. Because nobles were supposed to be above the chaos, protected by their status, surrounded by privilege. And yet, they were often the ones who fell into the strangest situations. Take a young lord, second or third in line for something important. Not quite powerful enough to be secure, but just important enough to be noticed. A dangerous position, really. He attends court. Says something mildly critical. Maybe not even intentionally. Just a passing remark, that lands a little too sharply. And suddenly, he's not attending court anymore. Instead, he's somewhere else. A quieter place. A place where time moves slowly, and conversations are limited. Because medieval justice, especially for the elite, wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes, it was about removal. Out of sight. Out of the conversation. Out of the way. And the interesting part is, this wasn't always seen as unusual. It was just how things were done. Now, let's gently shift to something even more subtle, the idea of forgotten names. Because for every well-documented case, every famous trial, every historical figure we still talk about, there were thousands, who left almost no trace at all. People who were recorded briefly, maybe a name in a ledger, a note in a document. And then, nothing. No follow-up. No detailed account. Just a quiet gap, where a life used to be. And in a way, that's what makes this topic so strangely calming. Not because it's cheerful, but because it's so still. There's no dramatic arc. No grand resolution. Just a slow fading out. Let's imagine another scene. A small holding cell. Stone walls. A wooden bench. A single figure sitting quietly, waiting. They don't know exactly what will happen next. Maybe they've been told something vague. Maybe not. Time passes. A guard walks by. Glances in. Keeps moving. And the person sitting there becomes part of the background. Another case. Another file. Another name that will likely be written down, and then slowly forgotten. Now, here's where we add a little dry humor, because history, even in its quiet moments, has a way of being unintentionally ironic. Some rulers were extremely concerned with maintaining order. Very serious about justice. Very focused on rules and structure. And yet, their systems were often wildly inconsistent. One day, a minor offense might be ignored. The next day, the same offense could lead to imprisonment. Because, of course, consistency is overrated when you're in charge of everything. And this unpredictability created a kind of quiet tension in everyday life. People learned to be careful. Not necessarily moral, just careful. Watch what you say. Watch who you say it to. And maybe, don't say anything at all. Which, if you think about it, is a very peaceful way to live. Slightly stressful, but peaceful. Now, let's drift toward another figure, someone a bit more unusual. A royal advisor. These were people who lived very close to power. They had influence, access, the ability to shape decisions. And, naturally, this made them both valuable, and incredibly vulnerable. Because being close to power means you're also close to blame. If something goes wrong, someone has to be responsible. And sometimes, that someone is the advisor who happened to be standing nearby. So, one day, they're offering counsel, sharing ideas, being part of important discussions. And the next, they're not. No dramatic announcement. No public explanation. Just absence. And maybe a quiet note somewhere, indicating that they've been removed from service. Which, in many cases, was a very polite way of saying, they've been moved somewhere less visible. Now, as we continue to move through this soft, fading landscape of forgotten justice, something becomes clear. This system wasn't designed to be fair, in the way we understand fairness today. It was designed to be functional. To maintain order. To resolve problems quickly. To keep things moving. Even if that meant leaving behind a long trail of quiet, unresolved stories. And those stories are what we're gently uncovering tonight. Not the loud ones. Not the famous ones. But the small ones. The ones that slipped through the cracks, and settled quietly into the background. Let's float over to one more scene before we slowly continue. A record room. Somewhere inside a castle or administrative building. Shelves lined with documents. Rolls of parchment. Ink fading slightly with time. A clerk sits at a table, writing. Name. Date. Brief description. A case. A decision. And then, the document is placed aside. Filed away. And over time, it becomes just another piece of paper among many. The name on it, slowly losing its meaning. Because no one comes back to ask what happened next. No one follows the story to its conclusion. It simply ends. And that quiet ending is where we find ourselves tonight. Not in the middle of grand events, but in the soft, fading edges of history, where lives were recorded briefly, judged quickly, and then gently, almost effortlessly, forgotten. So just relax, let your mind drift a little, and as we continue, we'll meet more of these figures, more quiet stories, more moments where justice was less about truth, and more about convenience. And somehow, in all that stillness, history keeps moving, slowly, quietly, forward.